Very much, Luka, for that introduction. So our first academic panel is going to be Security, Development Nexus in Theory and Practice. And joining us online is going to be Mabda Sidiq. She's a master's candidate at the LSE. Marija Fileva, advisor to the Prime Minister of North Macedonia. Lowe, who's a researcher, and Dursun Özkanca. She's the Chair of International Studies at Elizabethtown College. And our moderator is, again, Dr. Luka, Glusac, and he is the Assistant Director and Research Fellow at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory at the University of Belgrade. So everyone's just getting mic'd up, so once they're mic'd up, if they can make their way onto the stage. Thank you.
So welcome all again. Thank you all for joining us for the first panel of the academic event of the Belgrade Security Conference. I'm very much looking forward to discussing the relationship between the security and development with our excellent panelists, and thank Commander for introducing them. So if we are comfortable in our chairs, I would like to kick off with Oya. In your recent book, you have explored the nexus between development and security by offering a conceptual framework for interlinkages between security sector governance, security sector reform, and then with the SDGs, in particular SDG 16. So what have you identified as the most rewarding approach to bridging the gap between the two concepts?
Thank you, Luka, for having me here in this distinguished platform. Well, I would like to start by noting that today's challenges rarely happen in isolation from each other. As the introductory video that we watched vividly made it very clear, there are so many complex challenges that we face as the international community. And it is important for the practitioners as well as the academics to recognize the interlinkages between economic development and security-related issues. And I would like to acknowledge that SDGs do a very good job, as there has been an increasing recognition over the course of last decade or so that security and development issues need to be concurrently tackled by the international community. And SDG 16 really does a very excellent job in attempting to address the security sector reform and governance-related issues, and to tackle corruption, rule of law, access to justice, peaceful and inclusive institutions, and the protection of the world's most vulnerable populations, including women and children everywhere. And the fact that the pandemic made it very clear to the international community that these challenges have been exacerbated by the pandemic, the global disparities have increased immensely. To add to these strains, we have also seen that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has made it very clear to global audiences that there are problems with access to food and energy security related issues which need to be tackled all at once. So in the book that I wrote, in the SSR paper series that I published this this book, The Nexus Between Security Sector Governance Reform and Sustainable Development Goal number 16, I make the case that human security serves as an excellent bridge between security and development, and to help the international community in addressing the security sector governance and security sector reform, while at the same time acknowledging the fact that there are two sides of peace. Like you have mentioned in your introductory remarks, Luka, we shouldn't only seek to establish negative peace, which means the absence of violence and war. Instead, we should seek to establish positive peace, to integrate all members of the society and to ensure their well-being and welfare. And I argue that human security paradigm provides a great bridge between SSR and SDG 16 in the sense that it acknowledges the bottom-up nature of security. It is not state-centric in its approach, and it also ensures the multi-stakeholder involvement by creating inclusive, peaceful, and just institutions. So I argue that human security provides that bridge, and there are a lot of parallelities between SSR, SDG 16, and human security as well, in the sense that they all seek to have an inclusive institutions that are accountable and with oversight powers that are accrued to people. And the fact that freedom from fear, as I make a case in the book, freedom for fear would be counted towards negative peace, because you should be safe, you should be feeling safe against any potential attacks by state institutions, by other members of the society, and at the same time freedom from want and freedom to live in dignity, these two remaining human security concepts actually are all falling under the umbrella of positive peace. So it really provides a great framework in order to achieve these comprehensive goals that we have, and it recognizes the need for local ownership. And this is something that has been increasingly emphasized in peace-building missions, and to make sure to give voice to the people whose lives are at stake in order to designate what types of futures they would like to live under. That's another thing that is emphasized by empowerment and also protection, as well as prevention principles of human security.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for laying such a perfect foundation for our further discussion. You have also raised some of the issues that we should definitely explore during the Q&A part. And indeed, the 2030 agenda is the most ambitious plan, and let us be honest to say that many states struggle with achieving them. Let us turn to Marija, whose research explores exactly those main challenges. So, what are the biggest challenges faced by the states and their institutions in achieving the SDGs, in particular SDG 16, which focuses on peaceful, just, and accountable institutions?
Thank you, Luka, and thank you everyone for being with us today. Before I start with answering your question, I must emphasize the fact that the points of view are mine as PhD researcher, not the points of view of my government as government official, because I'm attending here as a PhD researcher on this academic event. And when we are mentioning about the states and they're struggling in achieving the SDGs, the crucial problem here is the SDGs are not legally binding under the national law. And here lies the problem, where we are having problems in the implementation in the SDGs. And in the same time, no matter, according to my personal opinion, how I think that the SDGs are probably the greatest thing that ever happened to all of the nations on a global level, I think that we must work on passing this obstacle and find a decent solution in the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goal. In the same time, we're having so many conflicts, insecurity, instability, and this is making the unsafe people even more unsafe, and they're even more struggling in achieving their peace on their daily life. And also, we can analyze the SDG 16 separately for all other the SDGs because, according also to my personal opinion, I think that the SDG 16 is the foundation of every other SDGs. And if we manage to have a proper implementation of the SDG 16, I think that we're going to have a much more smoother realization of the all SDGs agenda. And my solution and my idea and suggestion to this leads to the fact that we need to have a customized national roadmap that is going to show where we having problems in the implementation of the SDGs, because SDGs as a global agenda, they're reaching everyone in the same way, but we can't reach every state in the same way. We need to make a proper evaluation where we're having the problems, why we're having these problems. In the same time, we will reach states where they're having evaluation of the good things that they're doing, the key results that they're doing, and on the other side, we will have the results where we're missing. Do we miss resources? Do we miss people? Do we have the wrong people at the right places? And also, do we have institutions that are involved and it's not supposed to be involved in this occasion? And also, that leads to my conclusion that no matter how some strategy policy is par excellence on paper, if we don't manage to have a proper implementation in practice, we have failed as a society in the whole complex and the whole problem, etc., because we didn't manage to find the solution of the problem. And also, it's leading to the fact that we have a human obligation to leave no one behind, to use the UN occasion in this panel. And also, with the implementation of the promise to leave no one behind, we have the human obligation not only to develop the sustainability in the society, but also to make the society to be developed and secure, and the people themselves to feel secured and to feel sheltered while leading with example in the society.
Thank you so much for mapping those key challenges, but also indicating some of the opportunities that states should actually take advantage of in their effort to realize SDGs. But you have also mentioned the practice, and obviously SDGs are all about practice and how do we implement them. But we should also not forget the realization of the 2030 agenda does not only depend on the national actors. In many parts of the world, it is the international development actors that support and provide the necessary guidance to national authorities how to progress further. Still, we have rather little evidence on how the development practitioners understand the security and development nexus. And furthermore, the development covers so many different sectors which not necessarily communicate with each other. And Lorraine is actually conducting a research which should shed more light on this particular aspect. So I would like to ask you, what are the practitioners' perception of the security and development nexus? And does your research identify the ways to increase the effectiveness, particularly of the cross-sector collaboration?
So first, I just want to discuss the scope of our research. So
sure.
We engaged with a number of practitioners from the security, development, and humanitarian sectors. Mm-hmm. We decided to include the humanitarian sector for a number of different reasons, most obviously because of their presence in the same context as development and especially security actors. And the changing nature of crises, which are becoming more protracted, means that they are operating in more longer-term response models than what they previously have. We also had humanitarian workers reach out to us to engage with the research, so there is a self-identified role in the implementation of the Nexus from humanitarian workers. So some key themes emerged. Most significantly was that every practitioner recognized that they are operating in a collaborative context. And I think that that's really important because it just shows how present the Nexus is in the field, and this recognition that all the sectors need each other and need to support each other to deliver their mandate and achieve their objectives. But what we noticed was a need for more cross-sector communication and effective strategic alignment between the sectors. And this is important to note because as we were able to map a shift from confidence levels as we progress from settings of stability to fragility and crisis. So practitioners largely showed strong confidence levels in effective cross-sector collaboration during times of stability, which suggests that there is an opportunity to facilitate more dialogue and information sharing during that time. But as we moved towards fragility and crisis, confidence levels began to drop. And as we move to more protracted crises and face more crises, this is a really important point, because if there's a breakdown in communication during crises and we are now operating in more crises, then the Nexus is not going to be as effective in the field as what it should be. So this idea of communication really highlights a need for a shared language between the sectors. And this brings us back to the conceptual foundation of the Nexus, which is this flexible and adaptable framework that draws from different objectives of different sectors to meet the needs of the country context, which are constantly evolving. So it's not this rigid cookie-cutter scenario. It is there as a way to adapt. It's fluid. It's a way to connect the sectors to be able to respond to the specific needs. So that was a key finding for us, is this need for a shared language. We also noted a discursive and conceptual shift in both the answers and across new literature on the Nexus. So this idea of peace, and especially in the new emerging Nexus, which is the development humanitarian peace Nexus, it really highlights what our end goal is, what we're working towards, is positive peace, is sustainable peace. And it provides an opportunity to bring in a broader network of actors. So these new crises, we are seeing different actors. Yesterday we heard about human rights defenders and civil society organizations. Bringing them into the decision-making space and the design and implementation of the Nexus is really going to make it more robust and more effective in practice. And practitioners across all sectors noted a desire to understand each other's objectives more and to be able to speak to each other's objectives. So that, again, that really brings us back to this communication point. But just quickly, I want to return back to this idea of the protracted crisis. So the nature of crises are fundamentally changing. They're becoming more long-term, more complex, and they're reoccurring. They're impacting not only the country in which they're occurring, but also the region. And now we are facing these massive global challenges like what we're seeing with Ukraine. So almost all practitioners reported working in country contexts that are experiencing a protracted crisis. So it goes to show where the Nexus is actually operating. And as researchers and policymakers or practitioners, we need to ask ourselves, is the conceptual scope of the Nexus still relevant to today's context? Or does it reflect what was happening 20 years ago? And returning to your question about identifying ways of making it more effective, I think facilitating this dialogue between more actors and ensuring that we are feeding evidence-based material back into the Nexus and approaching it as a bottom-up approach, including those grassroots movements and understanding field experiences will really change the way that we engage with and implement the Nexus and ensure its sustainability in the long term.
Thank you so much for really putting the research that ideally should reconcile those different approaches and then should bring different sectors together. And thank you also for emphasizing the importance of shared language. And as an effective way, actually, there's a starting point to bring these different sectors together in their attempt to reconcile, so to say, development and security, particularly during protracted crises. Now I have the pleasure of inviting Mabda, who joined us virtually from Indonesia, to share the first findings of her research on how China invokes the notion of cyber sovereignty when discussing human rights in cyberspace. Welcome, Mabda, and I would like to ask you maybe as a first question, how does actually China use the notion of cyber sovereignty, particularly in international fora on cybersecurity?
Thank you, Luka, for the opportunity, and I'm very delighted to be among such distinguished panelists. Now, first, I would like to remind everyone that China is increasingly perceived as a leader in international dialogues, and particularly on cybersecurity. I believe that this applies to pretty much all sectors, all issues. And again, we have to go back to the idea that China is on the rise. It is continuously being framed as a leader, a global leader even. Really, it is still attached to the its identity as a representative of developing countries or the global South. So in combination, a lot of scholars have found that China's leadership ultimately rests on its claim that it represents or it identifies as a leader or a representative among developing countries or countries of the global South. But if we look into how the global South or countries, developing countries have been using the internet, we have to remind ourselves that many of these economies are increasingly reliant on the internet. Internet access has become an important part of development and their development agendas, with the increasing references to internet access and ensuring that it becomes universal and all population in the world, or most population in the world, has access to the internet. At the same time, China's leadership in governing cyberspace and regulating cyberspace at the global level is increasingly attached to this notion of cyber sovereignty, which we can increasingly see in speech text, in foreign policy text coming from China. And really the concept itself refers to the applicability of the principles of sovereignty in the cyberspace. This brings us to a lot of human rights concerns, understanding that it places the utmost responsibility over cyberspace on states. The most obvious ones is maximum state presence in the cyberspace. And I'm sure that we have seen a lot of its ramifications and consequences on the news every day. And here I'm trying to see how has China invoked made references to cyber sovereignty, particularly in multilateral forums. And I made the UN as my primary focus. But here we can, before going into what China has done in the UN, we can discuss what cyber sovereignty actually means. Cyber sovereignty itself underlies Xi Jinping's proposal for a community of shared future in cyberspace. It encapsulates a lot of ideas, but if we boil it down to 3 points, it points to how states are rightful of developing and regulating the cyberspace. Cyber sovereignty is essential to ensure regime stability, and state actors are the leaders of cyber governance. And China basically places a lot of importance on forums and dialogues occurring on the UN. Now, there are 2 points that we need to understand here. And this points to my argument that cyber sovereignty underpins China's advances in defining normalcy, or defining what is normal in cybersecurity governance. And second, cyber sovereignty constitutes Beijing's identity as a representative of developing country and the global South. Now, so what kind of normalcy does China promote in ensuring cybersecurity by evoking the notion of cyber sovereignty? The first and most obvious one is emphasizing the role of the state. And again, if we see the news every day, we can see that there are a lot of potentials, but there are also a lot of challenges to ensuring human rights in this respect. It claims that it draws from the UN Charter, and it claims that the internet is bounded to the territorial jurisdiction of the state. And there are contingencies between ICT policies and domestic situations. And here state is framed as the primary decision makers in what is going on in the cyberspace. But at the same time, while it emphasizes the role of the state, on the flip side, it also minimizes and undermines discussions on human rights. And this is applicable across a lot of China's communications and the text that it produces in a lot of dialogues happening in the UN. One of the primary examples is how under the UN OEWG, it has resisted discussions on human rights, which it claims to be not relevant with discussions on security in the internet. it claims that it should be discussed in other UN forums and should not be prioritized in the OEWG. While at the same time, the International Code of Conduct that it released with other states, members of these Shanghai Organization Corporation in 2011 and 2015, mentions that ensuring security in the cyberspace should be extensive in the sense that it should also extend to information security. And what does this imply? It implies that security is defined in a very broad term. It should also include content and information flowing through the cyberspace. And again, states are proposed to hold the utmost responsibility in safeguarding the flow of information. And again, this is associated with the idea of establishing a good order, and ultimately it points to the idea that the cyberspace should be a conducive space to ensure regime stability. And this proposal is really attractive to a lot of developing countries, and why? First, China attached a counter-hegemonic narrative to this idea because, I quote repeatedly, China states that no country should pursue cyber hegemony, and this is something that's repeatedly stated in their international cybersecurity cooperation text and strategies. And second, it is also attached with a commitment to providing assistance, especially in developing digital infrastructure. And I believe that this is something that is truly attractive to a lot of developing countries. And so this brings me to a point that I think was also stated by Luka in his opening remarks, that ensuring human rights in the cyberspace cannot be selective. And this applies to both to the so-called West and the other side of the spectrum. Developed and democratic countries should also understand the repercussions of their use of the internet to ensure that states and non-state actors, particularly internet companies who reside in developing countries, are always accountable. And that brings me to the end of my remark. Thank you, Luka.
Well, thank you, Mabda, especially for bringing the important nexus of human rights and security, and especially the dangers of narrow definitions of both security, but also human rights, especially in the context where the state really controls both the definition, but also the implementation of human rights. And indeed, many of you have actually mentioned human rights in the connection, obviously, with the security and development. So I would like that you expand a little bit on that before we open the floor to the questions from the audience. I think there is a really wide understanding that development should not be at the expense of human rights. Still, human rights are rather, while they are conceptually obviously present in the 2030 agenda, on the other side, they are only sporadically included in the targets and the indicators. So where would you actually place human rights in the discussion of the security and development nexus? Perhaps we can use the same order and then start with Oya.
Thank you, Luka. I think that human rights are in front and center of this discussion of the nexus between security and development. And I see this as a, full-on cycle as well. So I think that, it all started with the aspirations to protect the human rights, and the UN Agenda 2030 makes a lot of references to human rights and sets these goals to protect the human rights to a certain extent. And at the same time, so there is this give and take between human rights and sustainable development goals, I think. And the fact that we are targeting to protect the world's most vulnerable populations, the fact that we are trying to tackle corruption, we are trying to make sure that the institutions are accessible, just, and peaceful. We are trying to make sure to give voice to the most vulnerable populations in the world. I think that these are the goals that are identified, 17 goals that are identified in these Sustainable Development Goals, UN Agenda 2030, is really directly and indirectly addressing the human rights and seeking to protect human rights. I don't think that we can say say that human rights are a factor or an outcome. I see this as a full life cycle, if it makes sense, you know, going all the way back, and I think supporting the human rights overall in that way.
Thank you very much, Joya. And then, yeah, speaking of the human rights as preconditions or factors or intending consequence of the 2030 agenda, Marija, what would be your take on that?
Yeah, thank you, Luka. It's a great question. And I think that we can put the human rights in the three conditions also. We can analyze them also as a precondition, we can analyze them as a factor, and we can analyze it as a consequence. As a precondition, because I don't think that it has sense to talk for anything, not only about the SDGs if we don't have respectable human rights, because we have the human rights in a daily basis in many situations, and we can't talk about achieving, for example, the rule of law, forcing corruption, etc., if we don't have human rights in a decent way, because it's our living human obligation to live up to that and to make the human rights respectable. And after that, it's leading to the human rights analyzed as a factor, because here I can make the connection with the economy as a factor, because if we have a developed economy and we have the solid economic grounds, we have the solid economic grounds with many alternatives that are linked to security and development, and that are having the path and forcing the right path for the implementation of the human rights, where the human rights are respected. Because when we have the conflicts, we're facing nowadays many conflicts, we can see that many of the states are making some different choices that are affecting the human rights. And when the states are developed in that manner, that they're not going to have to choose between the human rights or the development of the country. And when you have a developed country, you have the grounds where the human rights can be respected, and that is leading where we can analyze the human rights as a intended consequence, because if we have a developed community where the human rights are respected, we are all enforcing and implementing the promise according to UN to leave no one behind in this process. And it's up to us, it's our legacy, how we're going to act in this time that is left from achieving the SDG, and what kind of message we are going to send, and what are we going to implement to make our society sustainable and developed in that manner.
Thank you, Marija. Lorraine, what would be your take?
Human rights are the driver of the Nexus. It is what drives us to work in this space. It is what drives us to be here today to discuss this. But let's not forget why they are so absent from the SDGs. This was purposefully done by states during the negotiation and the design. And so as we are facing all these new crises and these new challenges, these ongoing insecurities, you know, we see these different networks of actors involved in these crises. We have the rise of mercenaries threatening human rights. This is something that is new to the discussion of international security. How do we protect people from mercenaries? And so this really brings us back to the question of accountability. Who is accountable for monitoring human rights and protecting them? Is it the international community? Is it individual states? Is it the human rights defenders on the front lines, the people who are fighting for their own human rights or resisting in their daily lives? And we need to make sure that those people who are on the front lines are supported, they are advocated for, and they are empowered. And we need to bring it back to localizing human rights too. And this doesn't just belong to authoritarian states. You know, as someone from Australia, we pride ourselves on our role in the international community and our peacekeeping missions. So on one hand, we engage in peacekeeping missions, but then on the other, we indefinitely detain refugees. And just this week, we denied the UN access to the refugee detention centres. That really goes to show that this is happening everywhere, and we need to recommit to human rights and reintegrate it back into the international and the local mechanisms to make sure that they are protected for everyone and accessible for everyone.
Thank you so much, especially for bringing also the UN to the picture, especially in terms of peacekeeping operations, but also in terms of the access of not only UN, but also other important actors and their access to refugees. Mabda, what would be your take on the on the role of human rights, either in the particular Chinese context of human rights in cyberspace or more broadly.
Yeah, I think I absolutely share the view of the previous speakers, in which that it is at the center stage of ensuring that the SDGs would be fulfilled. But I think especially in terms of, in the light of cyberspace, in light of the internet and technology in general, I think the fact that human rights should be a precondition achieving development, I think it is particularly important because I share the view that the use of technology is very much determined by humans or the users. And in terms of the internet, the limits or that the sort of constraints that the users of the internet faces are pretty much also determined by the humans that has the ability to instill or establish laws or regulations placed upon it. So I think human rights should be in the back of everyone's mind prior to designing certain technology or certain platforms in regards to the internet. And I think this brings me to the ninth goal of the SDGs, which is, if I'm not mistaken, it says that it aims to ensure universal and affordable access to the internet. I think in this regard, before we can make sure that everyone or the majority of the global population has access to the internet, we should ensure that the internet itself would empower the user, would empower the people who would have access to them. And in this regard, I believe that before we think of ensuring access, we should think about the design. And before we should think about the design, we should ensure that the fundamentals that underlies the design would not ultimately lead to potential human rights violations. And that brings me back to the fact that still humans are still at the center or still having the control of making sure that human rights are at the center of the considerations. So I believe that in terms of the internet, I think having regarding human rights as a precondition is especially important.
Thank you so much, Mabda, and particularly for bringing the issue of the right to internet access, actually, because that's one of the most vivid current discussion in human rights more broadly. Now I would like to open the floor for the questions from the audience. I see Sonia. Whether do we have yeah, the mic is coming.
Sonia Stojanovic-Gajic, member of the board of BCSP, and Luka is also member of BCSP's board. One more title to mention. Thank you for the panel. I have a short comment and followed with a question. So, having worked 2 decades on security sector reform, a bit less on SDGs, what I think BCSP and a number of other organizations facing as a problem is the assumptions behind these concepts, which rely primarily on state to resolve the problems, focus a lot on institutions and formal mechanisms, and SDG is a bit better because it at least lists the outcomes, so it's not only about the institutional mechanisms, but also what should be a result. But what we are seeing, not just in Serbia, but we've discussed yesterday, majority of countries today are neither dictatorships nor liberal democracies, but hybrid regimes with a facade of democracy and practice which is not democratic. We see these things being delivered, security sector reform, SDGs, but actually not delivering the equal access to justice. And I'll just give 2 short examples. SDGs about fighting human trafficking, and BCSP together with colleagues here in the region was monitoring this in relation, and what we see is our government, before the time to submit statistics to EU on EU accession, pumps up the statistics. They say we have this few convictions on human trafficking. They're not really convictions on organized crime, serious cases of human trafficking, but they are, prostitution, so lower level, and, blaming the victim and not providing the protection, and these kind of things, or, organized crime. They deliver on arresting the big criminal when it matters to Germany, but this big criminal comes and does money laundering at home. So what I want to ask is, why should we use SDGs and SSR as our advocacy reference, as our conceptual reference, when they can be misused while keeping the facade of delivering accountable institutions and so on. And last example, Serbia has been considered for quite some time having the best freedom of access to information law, which is also one of our SDG indicators. It has recently been changed. It's still a very good law, but these key things that were changed make the key issues for corruption, like
Recording in progress.
International. Hello to those. Just the right time to say key issues of corruption, international deals on dirty, investments, national security exempted, and so on. So the rest of the law is perfect, but these few things. So why should we care and use these references when they are used to mask the bad things?
Thank you so much, Sonia. Does anyone like to start with addressing it?
Sure.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, please.
Yeah. You are making beautiful points, Sonia, and I share your, skepticism in terms of meeting some of these, indicators and the reports that are provided by the governments. But I am a pragmatic person in nature, and I feel like you have to start from somewhere, and some progress is better than no progress, in the sense that you have to start by creating responsive institutions and hopefully designate them and format them in a way that is acceptable for international norms. And to me, norms and system also interact on a constant basis. So maybe throughout the years, you may just wait and see for the culture change as a result of the institutions. I know that this is a very optimistic view, but I think that it is better than not doing anything and not working towards a particular, goal, in my opinion. So,
Thank you. Marija?
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. Before I start answering, thank you, because it's a great point, and it's really in line with what I want to achieve with my paper, because I was facing this kind of issue, masquerading the real things in front of papers, reports, etc. Because before my current position, I was working in a private sector for around 7 years, and after that I came on this position, and I saw this thing that many of the things, when you don't want to show the real thing, you're putting a report and report of the report and report of the report, and I was just like this, okay, what do you want to achieve with this? What are the key results? What are the deliverables, etc.? And that's why I'm proposing in my paper that it's not enough just to have the SDGs and to issue this kind of reports that we have progress in this SDG for this and this and this, but to make an analysis and evaluation, what are we missing here and what are the real results in the institution, and facing the real challenges that are addressing the SDGs. And when we are if we are going to have, because this is my suggestion, to have a national roadmap where we will have a responsible person that he's going or she is going, or many group of people are going to address this issue, are going to follow up. What are we missing here? Okay, this institution is responsible for this SDG, and it's not issuing the right result or deliverable here. What are we missing here, and what is the problem here? And I think that if we change the attitude and not analyzing the SDGs only like a non-binding instrument, because many of the included stakeholders are covering behind the paradigm because it's not binding, and they're addressing the point that they don't have the legal obligation to address some things. Even all of the things in the SDGs are already addressed in the national laws. But if we have the right mechanism, we will have responsibility for these kind of things. And I'm always standing for the point of view to be accountable for our own action and to lead by example, because if we send the message that one institution is facing this SDG, is delivering the right results, but not only the results, like I said, report, we made this, we presented the report and nothing after the report and nothing about the evaluation process. And also when we are going to have the timetable, what we achieved for the first month, the 6th month, the first year, what we have a problem here, how we deal with the problem. I think that that's the way we are sending a message that we are dealing in the right way in the implementation of the SDG. I hope that I answered somehow your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Marija. Before I joined academia, I was working in the Serbian Ombudsman office, where I was actually in charge of making annual and other reports. I can only, argue that the reports are very important. So, but Lorraine, please.
I'm really excited by this question. This is my favorite topic, the normative assumptions of SSR. They are equally important in upholding the framework of SSR, but they can undermine it so quickly. So I think looking at it through a gender-responsive lens is so important to the meaningful implementation of these frameworks and to meaningfully work towards these goals. So in terms of human trafficking, why are people turning towards this? How are people ending up in these scenarios? And looking at inclusion and who is working in the sectors that are responding to these. Do we have the right amount of training? Do we have the right people in here? Do people feel safe to turn to these security providers? Or is there a disconnect there? And is that fueling, these illicit trades or human trafficking or these alternative organised crimes? So, and going back to Oya's conversation before about the way that the informal and formal rules interact with each other, recognising that is really important. And SSR and SDGs, SSR, it often excludes acknowledging that, but I think the SDGs provide this really positive platform to feed that back into it and identify meaningful ways of meeting the needs of people and responding to what they need and what they're missing. So access to education and employment and just offering basic human rights is such a fundamental way of overcoming these challenges and really strengthening that connection between civil society and states, and especially the security sector.
Thank you very much. And we'll just add that, I think Sonia, really put the great point of the SDGs provide us with the outcome, where we're heading. And then just the, SSG is just I think the best possible roadmap that we have. So it shows the way and how we should approach it. But Sonia also raised a very important issue of access to information, and then I would just maybe like to ask Mabda, especially access to information, but also access to internet. You have already raised it, but can we actually talk about the access to information in highly centralized states such as China? But I also invite you to address it from a broader perspective, if you would like to.
Sure. I think I also share especially Marija's views on this, because I think, of course, it's important to not turn this into another just report-making project. And on top of that, I think it's also important to not make SDGs as a simply as a ticking the box or ticking the checklist project. And I think this is something that me speaking from the perspective of someone who lives in developing country could say, because I think a lot of projects which are dating back to the 90s, the 80s, has been highly criticized for its lack of sustainability. And I think this is something that should be definitely addressed. In terms of, in the context of a highly centralized state, I think it is also important that we should ensure accountability. And again, I think in terms of technology, accountability is an important thing, because it is not something in terms of technology, a lot of things could be taken for granted very easily. And I think there's something that a lot of people should have in mind in terms of ensuring the involvement of the use of technology, ensuring SDGs, that accountability or ensuring accountability is built into the designs of many of these technologies. So I think in terms of ensuring accountability, I think that would be my point. But again, I think I would also go back to the fact that I think we should also be cognizant of the fact that in a lot of instances, developmental related projects and agenda oftentimes only turn into a project that is essentially a checklist ticking project. And I think that is something that should a lot of leaders, a lot of not only states but also non-state actors should bear in mind. So yeah, I think that would be my response.
Thank you very much for your insight. I think we have maybe time for one more question before we have to close the panel. Yeah, I see the hand in the back. Yes.
Okay. Hi. Hi, my name is Tatiana Papic. I'm from Union University, Belgrade. And this is the question for Marija. Being a lawyer, you emphasized, obviously, a need for legally binding instruments to secure these goals we want to attain. But let me provoke you, being a lawyer, I might be allowed to provoke you in this way. Do you think that would be enough? Do you think anything would change if these goals were legally binding? I'm hinting at the fact that you have many legally binding international instruments that states constantly are violating or interpreting in a way that can justify their action, which are either authoritarian or like whatever you like. So what I'm hinting at is to, in a way, inspire you to give us more arguments, maybe in a sense of sociology of law, because in my mind, it's a tough thing to say for me, being a lawyer, that legally binding would not do.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Please.
Thank you very much for your question. I must make a clarification here that I mentioned that it's the core problem here that it's not legally binding. I didn't say that it's the solution to be legally binding. I said that the solution is to make a customized attempt to make the SDGs according to each state capacities and analyzing each other capacities. And I mentioned the moment of non-binding here because I know that it's affecting human mind differently when it's legally binding, because I'm analyzing institution on my daily basis, only in a way that when some of the institutions know and people working in this institution know that something is legally binding, they are acting differently when it's legally binding. You don't have the remark that, okay, we can act upon this, but it's not legally binding, But when you have something that is legally binding, you're changing the awareness and you're raising the awareness about the things. We need to work a lot about raising awareness in achieving the SDGs. And I just mentioned that we need to analyze and to be focused because, as I mentioned also previously, many of the things in the SDGs we have in our national law, regulations, etc., and it's not the problem in our laws. And I can say that we have a great laws, and I know that you also in Serbia have a great laws because we're very similar here. But I think the problem is in the implementation because, as I mentioned, it's not okay only to have the reports that we have a great SDGs, we have a great harmonization, etc., etc. I'm always result-oriented and I want result. At the end of the day, I want to know what I have achieved, what my people have achieved, and what I have been doing in the day, in the month, in the past year, in the past years, for making people's life better, And I think that we're going to make people's life better because I think that I have the obligation to have a positive impact on my people and the people I'm working with. And I'm always oriented how to find the solution to their problems. And I don't think that if we're just sticking only on raising awareness how the SDGs are the greatest global actions ever, we're not going to achieve that. That's why I was supposing and proposing that every state need to have a customized attempt to make these things and clarification in the implementation of the SDGs. And I think that that's the key for making a positive impact in the society, when we're delivering, not only making reports and not only being led by an instruments that are not only legally binding, but instruments that are actually making people's lives better at the end of the day. You know, because when people are struggling and they're having their daily problems, they want a result, they want an improvement in their daily life. And my suggestion was in this connotation that if we all work in a manner to provide results, not only to have paper, I think that we're going to achieve the SDGs according to the time that is left in this decade of deliverable. Thank you.
Thank you, Marija, and thank Professor Papic for this question. I would definitely suggest to address this issue in your upcoming paper for the Journal of Regional Security. And also, I would like to invite you all to follow the web page of the journal in the upcoming months. And I hope really that many of the papers will find their way out of the complex peer review process, and then we'll see the light and will be published in the Journal of Regional Security. I also invite you to Oya's book is also available here, also to access it online. I think this is really the first comprehensive attempt to explore the linkages between the SSG and SDG 16. And with that, I would like to thank Oya, Marija, Lorraine, and Mabda for joining us. I also would like to thank you all for also joining us for this panel. And yeah, we're looking forward to the second panel of the academic event, which I believe is coming up after the break, but we'll see. Amanda will confirm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. There's coffee now for 10 minutes, and then you're back here. The next panel is going to be the case studies, security development nexus and peace building and conflict prevention. Thank you all.